Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Whispers at Night. Tonight, we're plunging deep into the shadowy heart of the Appalachian Mountains with 9 chilling, real-life accounts from folks whose encounters left them forever changed. These aren't made-up ghost stories or campfire yarns. They're raw, first-hand testimonies from ordinary people who stumbled into the unexplainable. Each one reached out to me because they couldn't keep it bottled up anymore. They need the world to know that something ancient and hungry lurks in those mist-shrouded peaks. If you're joining us for the first time, hit that subscribe button for more bone-chilling true tales, and don't forget to ring the bell. Real terror has a way of sneaking up when you least expect it. Now, settle in as we hear from 9 brave souls who survived the unspeakable. Or did they? My name is David Chen, and for 8 years, I've been part of the Shenandoah Valley Search and Rescue Team. I've seen it all, or so I thought. I've pulled lost hikers from the jaws of ravines, found elderly wanderers miles from civilization, and recovered bodies from places so remote and forbidding they would make your skin crawl. But what happened on Old Rag Mountain in the autumn of 2019 still keeps me awake at night. A cold knot of dread in my stomach, questioning everything I thought I knew about the wilderness and the people we search for within it. The call came in on a crisp Thursday morning, the air sharp with the promise of winter. Marcus Webb, a 34-year-old software engineer from Richmond, had failed to return from a solo hiking trip on the Old Rag Circuit Trail. His girlfriend, her voice tight with panic over the phone, reported him missing after he didn't show up for work on Monday morning. The profile she gave was clear and detailed. Marcus was an experienced hiker, 6 feet tall, with brown hair and a distinctive thin scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood bicycle accident. He always, she stressed, carried a bright orange Osprey backpack. He'd been planning to spend the weekend camping and hiking the more remote, less traveled sections of the mountain. Our team assembled at the Nethers trailhead before dawn on Friday. The morning mist clung to the mountainside like ghostly fingers, and a profound silence hung in the air, heavier than usual. Even the birds seemed subdued, their morning chorus strangely muted. Besides myself, we had Sarah Martinez, our tracking specialist, whose eyes could read a story in a single broken twig. Tom Bradley, a local who'd been hiking these mountains for 30 years, and knew their secrets better than anyone. And Jennifer Walsh, our medical officer, calm and competent in any crisis. We split into 2 groups to cover Morse, ground. Sarah and Tom took the main Old Rag Trail, the most likely route, while Jen and I headed toward the more treacherous backcountry paths where an injured hiker might have sought shelter. The terrain was brutal. Thick underbrush clawed at our clothes, loose rock faces threatened to give way under our boots, and steep drop-offs lay hidden by decades of fallen leaves. As we climbed higher, the temperature dropped noticeably, and a thin, clammy fog began rolling in from the valleys below, swallowing the landscape and muffling all sound. Around noon, Tom's voice crackled over the radio, sharp with static. "Base camp, this is Tom. We've got him. Marcus Webb, alive and conscious, about 2 miles up the fire road near Corbin Hollow." The relief that washed over me was immediate and immense. It's the feeling we live for in this line of work. Jen and I immediately began making our way toward their coordinates. But as we hiked, a small, nagging feeling of unease began to prick at the back of my mind. Tom's voice had sounded off. Not quite the unbridled enthusiasm you'd expect from finding a missing person alive after 3 days in the wilderness. There was a strange, tense undercurrent to his words that I couldn't quite place. We found Tom and Sarah about an hour later, standing with a man who perfectly matched Marcus Webb's description. Same height, same build, same brown hair. He was even wearing the bright orange Osprey backpack we'd been told to look for. But the moment I laid eyes on him, a cold alarm bell started ringing in my head. "Marcus," I called out as we approached, forcing a reassuring smile. "I'm David Chen with Search and Rescue. Your girlfriend's been worried sick about you." The man turned toward me with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. They were strangely flat, like polished stones. "Oh, yes," he said, his voice pleasant enough, but with a hollow, echoing quality, like a voice in an empty room. "Rebecca. She worries too much." "What happened out here?" Jen asked immediately, moving into her medical assessment mode, her professionalism a comforting anchor in the strange atmosphere. "Where have you been for 3 days?" "Got turned around," he said simply, shrugging his shoulders with a casualness that felt rehearsed. "Lost track of time. You know how it is in these mountains. All the trails look the same after a while." But that's when I noticed the first glaring inconsistency. This man's hands were clean, not just relatively clean, but pristine. After 3 days and nights lost in the wilderness, even the most prepared hiker would have dirt under their fingernails, scratches on their arms, something to show for their ordeal. His hiking boots looked like they'd barely touched the trail. I caught Sarah's eye, and she gave an almost imperceptible shake of her head. She'd noticed it too. Tom, however, seemed unnaturally eager to get moving. "We should head back," he said quickly, his voice a little too loud. "Get him checked out, reunite him with his girlfriend." As we began the hike back down the mountain, I tried to engage the man in conversation, testing him with information we already knew. "So, what do you do for work?" I asked. "Computer stuff," he replied vaguely, his eyes scanning the trees. "Programming and such." When I asked about Richmond, where the real Marcus supposedly lived, his answers were equally non-specific. He described the city in terms so general that an young who'd visited once could have provided them. No favorite restaurants, no specific neighborhoods, no personal details that would indicate actual familiarity with the area. But it was the scar that truly bothered me, or rather the lack thereof. Marcus Webb's girlfriend had been adamant about a distinctive scar above his left eyebrow. This man's face was a smooth, unmarked canvas. "How did you get that scar?" I asked casually, gesturing toward his left eyebrow. He reached up and touched the spot, and for just a fraction of a second, his calm expression flickered, like a mask slipping slightly. "Fell off my bike when I was 7, he said, the words coming out a little too smoothly, but there was no scar there, none at all. I radioed ahead to base camp, my heart starting to pound a slow, heavy rhythm. "I need you to contact Marcus Webb's girlfriend for additional identifying information, something specific." The response came back 20 minutes later, the dispatcher's voice tinny and distant. "Rebecca confirms Marcus has a small birthmark on his right shoulder, shaped like a crescent moon. Also, he's allergic to bee stings and carries an EpiPen in his backpack." During our next rest stop, I asked to check his backpack for the EpiPen. "Standard procedure," I lied, "for anyone with known allergies." He hesitated for the first time since we'd found him, his eyes darting towards Tom, then slowly removed the orange pack. Inside were generic hiking supplies, but no EpiPen. And when I asked him to roll up his sleeve to show me his mosquito bites, his right shoulder was completely, perfectly unmarked. That's when things got really strange. As the afternoon wore on and we descended deeper into the valley, the man began exhibiting behaviors that raised every alarm bell in my head. He walked with an odd, measured gait, as if he was consciously thinking about each step, like a puppet learning to use its strings. His responses to our questions became more delayed, as though he was processing the words differently than a normal person would. Most unsettling of all, he never looked directly at any of us for more than a few seconds at a time, his gaze always sliding away. Tom kept urging us to move faster, which was completely out of character for him. In all our years working together, he'd always been methodical, safety-focused, but now he seemed almost panicked to get this man off the mountain. When I tried to slow our pace to do a more thorough medical evaluation, Tom became agitated. "He's fine," he insisted, his voice sharp. "Let's just get him back to civilization." But Jen wasn't buying it either. During a brief moment when Marcus had wandered a few steps ahead to look at something in the trees, she whispered to me, her voice low and urgent. "His pupils aren't responding normally to light changes. And his pulse is weird. It's too slow, too regular. It's like his heart is beating to a metronome. As the sun began to set, we were still several miles from the trailhead. We decided to make camp for the night, rather than risk navigating the rocky terrain in darkness. The man didn't seem to have any opinion about this decision one way or the other, which struck me as profoundly odd. Most people who'd been lost for days would be desperate to get home, to contact their loved ones, to sleep in a real bed. While Tom and Sarah set up the tents, I tried one more test. "Hey, Marcus, want to call Rebecca and let her know you're okay?" I offered him my satellite phone. He read at the device for several long seconds, as if he'd never seen one before. "Oh, that's all right," he finally said, that hollow smile returning. "I'll surprise her when I get back." That night, none of us slept well. The man sat by the dying campfire long after the rest of us had turned in, staring into the flames with an expression I can only describe as utterly empty. When I woke around 2 a.m. to check on him, he was still sitting in exactly the same position, unmoving, unblinking. The fire had burned down to embers, but he made no move to add more wood. "You okay?" I whispered. He turned his head toward me with that same hollow smile. "Just enjoying the peace and quiet," he said. But his voice had changed. It was subtly different, with different inflections, as if someone else was learning to use his vocal cords. I pretended to go back to sleep, but I kept watching him through barely cracked eyelids. For the next 2 hours, he didn't move. Not once. He didn't shift his weight, didn't scratch an itch, didn't even seem to blink. He just sat there, a motionless statue staring into the darkness beyond our camp. At dawn, my hands shaking, I radioed base camp again. "This is David. I need you to contact the Richmond Police Department and ask them to do a welfare check on Marcus Webb's apartment. Something's not right here." The response came back an hour later, just as we were breaking camp. The dispatcher's voice was strained, terrified. "David, you need to abort the mission and return immediately." Richmond PD found Marcus Webb's body in his apartment. He's been dead for at least 5 days. My blood turned to ice. I looked over at the thing we'd been calling Marcus, who was calmly packing his orange backpack as if he hadn't heard the radio transmission. But I knew he had heard it. And for just a moment, when he glanced up at me, his face seemed to shift, to ripple. The features remained the same, but there was something ancient and predatory in his eyes, something that had never been human. "Tom," I said quietly, my voice a strangled whisper. "We need to talk." But Tom was already backing away, his face pale with a terror that was bone deep. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It found me first. Yesterday morning. It was wearing Marcus's face then too. But something was wrong with the eyes. It said if I helped it get off the mountain, it would let me live." Sarah had heard the radio transmission too, and the color had drained from her face. "What is it?" she breathed, her hand reaching for the emergency flare in her pack. The thing that looked like Marcus Webb slowly stood up, and as it did, its appearance began to fluctuate, like looking at someone through a heat shimmer. The edges of its form became unstable. It was still recognizably human-shaped, but wrong in ways that made my brain struggle to process what I was seeing. "You've been very helpful," it said, but the voice was different now, layered, as if multiple people were speaking in perfect, chilling unison. I was getting tired of wandering these mountains alone. We ran. All of us, even Tom, despite whatever twisted deal he thought he'd made. We crashed through the underbrush, leaping over fallen logs, sliding down embankments, driven by a terror so primal it bypassed rational thought. Behind us, something gave chase, but not in any way that made sense. I could hear it moving through the trees, but the sounds came from above us, below us, from directions that should have been impossible. We reached the trailhead as the sun was setting, bursting out of the tree line like we were escaping from hell itself. Our vehicles were waiting where we'd left them, and we didn't stop running until we were all locked inside Tom's truck, the engine roaring. "What was that thing?" Jennifer gasped, her body still shaking uncontrollably. None of us had an answer. The official report stated that Marcus Webb died of natural causes in his Richmond apartment. Our search and rescue mission was logged as unsuccessful, no subject found. Tom quit the team the next week. Sarah transferred to a unit that operates in the desert southwest, as far from dense forests as she could get. Jennifer still works with us, but she won't take missions in that section of the Blue Ridge Mountains. And me? I still lead search and rescue operations, but I carry different equipment now. Silver bullets in my sidearm, iron filings in my pack, and a small mirror that I check constantly to make sure my reflection still looks like me. Because somewhere in those ancient Appalachian Mountains, something is still wearing Marcus Webb's face, still carrying his orange backpack, still waiting for the next group of helpful humans to lead it back to civilization. The mountains of Appalachia have been home to things older than human memory, entities that learned long ago how to wear our faces and speak our names. We like to think we've tamed the wilderness, but there are still hollow places between the trees where something watches and waits and learns. And sometimes it follows us home. My name is Jake Morrison, and for 15 years I've been running timber operations in the Daniel Boone National Forest. I've cut oak and poplar from every ridge and hollow in eastern Kentucky, worked through storms that could level entire stands of trees, and dealt with every kind of dangerous wildlife these mountains have to offer. But what happened in the fall of 2019 near Red River Gorge still makes me check the tree line twice before I step out of my truck. We'd been contracted to do selective logging on a 40-acre tract in the deep woods, about 12 miles southeast of Slade. The area was remote, even by our standards. No cell phone service, no nearby roads, just virgin forest that hadn't been touched by human activity in decades. The Kentucky Department of Natural Resources had marked specific trees for removal. It was good, honest work. What we didn't know was that we were entering territory that something else considered its own. My crew consisted of 4 experienced men: Tommy Hendricks on the chainsaw, Marcus Webb on our small bulldozer, Carl Jenkins handling maintenance, and Jimmy Patterson as our spotter. We set up our base camp on a Tuesday morning at the end of an old fire road. The forest around us was thick with mature hardwoods, an understory so dense you couldn't see more than 50 feet in any direction. The first sign something was wrong came at the end of our second day. We'd dropped 3 large, diseased oaks and cut them into manageable sections. But when we returned to the site the next morning, we found something that defied explanation. 2 of the oak sections, each weighing over 1,000 pounds, had been moved during the night. Not rolled or dragged, but lifted and carried about 30 yards deeper into the forest, where they had been carefully stacked against a massive boulder like cordwood. "Ain't no way the wind did that," Tommy said, his voice low. "And there's no equipment tracks." The ground around where the logs had originally been placed showed deep impressions, prints that looked almost human, but were easily twice the size of a man's boot and sunk so far into the earth that whatever made them had to weigh at least twice what any of us did. We should have packed up and left right then. But we had a contract to fulfill. Instead, we convinced ourselves there had to be a rational explanation. As we worked that day, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The normal sounds of the forest gradually faded away until we were working in an oppressive silence that seemed to swallow the noise of our chainsaws. It was Carl who first noticed the claw marks. On a stand of mature poplars, deep gouges ran from about 7 feet high down to the ground. The marks were fresh, the wood underneath still light and weeping sap. The spacing of the scratches indicated claws or fingers that were at least 8 inches apart, belonging to hands that would dwarf those of any human. "Black bear," Marcus suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. The scratches were too deep, too deliberate, and positioned too high on the trees. That night, we decided to post a watch. Jimmy took the first shift. Around midnight, he woke the rest of us with urgent whispers. "Something's out there," he said, his voice tight with fear. "Been moving around in the trees for the last hour. Big. Real big." We grabbed our flashlights and scanned the darkness. At first we saw nothing. Then Tommy's light caught something that made us all freeze. 2 red points of light, glowing back at us from the forest, positioned about 8 feet off the ground and spaced too far apart to be those of any normal animal. As we watched, the lights moved with a deliberate, measured slowness, as if something was studying us. Then they vanished. We spent the rest of the night huddled around our fire. When dawn broke, we found fresh tracks around the perimeter of our camp, the same massive, human-like impressions, circling our sleeping area like a predator evaluating its prey. The next day brought the incident that finally broke us. We were working on felling a particularly large oak when the forest suddenly went completely silent. Not the gradual quieting, but an instant, total absence of sound. Tommy shut off his chainsaw, and in the sudden quiet, we could hear something moving through the underbrush toward our position. The sounds weren't right for any animal we knew. Too heavy for a deer, too large for a bear, accompanied by a rhythmic cracking of branches that suggested something was deliberately breaking its way through the forest. As the sounds grew closer, a smell reached us that made our stomachs churn, a mixture of rotting meat, wet fur, and the sulphurous stench of a deep cave. Then we saw it. The creature emerged from a thicket about 30 yards away, moving upright on 2 legs, but with a gait that was unmistakably inhuman. It stood at least 8 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they seemed to span nearly 4 feet across. Its entire body was covered in coarse, dark, matted hair. The head was the most disturbing part, essentially human in shape but wrong in every detail. The face was flatter than a person's, with a protruding jaw full of yellowed teeth designed for tearing. Booze. It was the eyes that truly terrified us. Intelligent, calculating, and glowing with that same hellish red light we'd seen the night before. The beast stood there for what felt like an eternity, examining us with the focused attention of a predator. Its massive hands hung at its sides, the fingers ending in claws that could have easily created the marks on the trees. Tommy was the first to break. He dropped his chainsaw and ran, crashing through the underbrush like a man fleeing for his life. His panic was contagious. Within seconds, the rest of us were following suit, abandoning thousands of dollars worth of equipment in our desperate flight. Behind us, we could hear the creature moving, not chasing us, but paralleling our path through the forest, as if it were escorting us off its territory. We didn't stop running until we reached our trucks. It wasn't until we reached Slade and stopped at a diner that we realized none of us had suffered so much as a scratch. Whatever the creature was, it hadn't tried to hurt us. It had simply made it clear that we were no longer welcome. The next day, I called the Kentucky Department of Natural Resources. The official I spoke with listened to my story without interruption, then told me that our logging contract had been administratively suspended due to unexpected wildlife concerns. He said other contractors had reported unusual animal activity in that section of the forest and that the area was being temporarily closed. We never got our equipment back. 3 weeks later, I received a check from the state for the full replacement value, along with a non-disclosure agreement that strongly suggested I not discuss the incident. The official explanation was that our equipment had been damaged by a landslide, but I knew better. I started paying more attention to stories from other loggers. The accounts were remarkably consistent. Encounters with massive, upright walking creatures, equipment moved or destroyed overnight, strange howls, and the overwhelming sense of being watched. The Daniel Boone National Forest covers over 700,000 acres. In a wilderness that vast, it's not unreasonable to think that species unknown to modern science might still exist. Today, I run a much smaller operation, working on private land close to established roads. My crew still works together, but we never discuss what happened that October. Tommy refuses to work any job that requires overnight camping. Carl won't work in any forest where he can't see his truck from the work site. Sometimes, when we're working near the edge of the national forest, we hear it, the distant crack of branches, the echo of howls that don't match any animal in the field guides, and the persistent feeling that something ancient and powerful is watching us from the shadows, making sure we remember the boundaries that separate our world from a wilderness that belongs to older, stronger things. My grandfather's old moonshine cabin seemed like the perfect retreat, a place to escape the noise of the city and reconnect with my roots. It wasn't until I learned why he abandoned it 60 years ago that I understood some places are better left to the ghosts that claim them. My name is Tyler Morrison, and in the fall of 2018, I inherited 43 acres of prime Tennessee mountain land from my grandfather Ezra when he passed. The property sat in a remote hollow about 20 miles southeast of Gatlinburg, accessible only by a narrow, rutted dirt road that wound through thick stands of oak and poplar trees like a forgotten secret. Grandpa Ezra had always been tight-lipped about why he'd left the place to rot for nearly 6 decades. He'd always changed the subject whenever I brought up the old cabin or asked about his past, his eyes clouding over with a shadow I didn't understand. After his funeral, when the deed was finally in my hands, I figured it was time to find out what secrets those mountains were keeping. The drive up to the property took nearly an hour from the main highway, following a twisting path that seemed to get narrower with each mile. Ancient rhododendron bushes pressed close to the road, their twisted skeletal branches scraping against the sides of my truck as I climbed higher into the hollow. The air grew cooler, carrying the earthy scent of damp leaves and something else, something acrid and vaguely sweet that I couldn't quite place. When I finally reached the clearing where the cabin sat, the first thing that struck me was the silence. It was an absolute, oppressive quiet that seemed to swallow sound itself. No bird songs, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. The cabin was in worse shape than I'd expected. Built from hand-hewn logs sometime in the 1920s, according to the county records, it sagged under the weight of decades of neglect. The front T-porch had partially collapsed, and kudzu vines had claimed most of the eastern wall, their thick, green tendrils like grasping fingers. But what really caught my attention were the ruins behind the main structure, the crumbling stone foundations of what had clearly been a distillery. Scattered among the weeds were pieces of copper piping, the sharp, glittering shards of broken mason jars, and the rusted skeletal remains of what looked like steel components. This had definitely been a moonshine operation, and a substantial one at that. I spent that first weekend just exploring, taking photos, and making notes about what repairs would be needed to make the place habitable again. The plan was simple: fix up the cabin as a weekend retreat, a place to hunt and fish, and maybe rent it out to other hunters during deer season. But as I worked, strange things began happening that made me question whether this was such a good idea after all. Tools would go missing, only to turn up in impossible places. My hammer, which I'd left on the porch railing, I found balanced perfectly on a fence post 50 yards away. My level, which had been in my toolbox, I discovered standing upright in the middle of the creek. At first, I chalked it up to my own absent-mindedness, the disorienting effect of working in an unfamiliar place. It was during my third visit that I first smelled it, the overwhelming, gut-wrenching stench of rotting grain mash. The odor hit me as soon as I stepped out of my truck, so strong it made my eyes water and my stomach lurch. I searched everywhere for the source, thinking maybe an animal had died somewhere nearby. But I found nothing. The smell lingered for hours, a thick, nauseating miasma, then vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving behind only the normal forest scents of moss and decay. When I mentioned it to Tom Bradley at the hardware store in town, the same Tom who'd been on that strange search and rescue mission I'd heard whispers about, his face went pale, and he quietly suggested I might want to reconsider my renovation plans. The incidents escalated during my fourth weekend at the property. I was replacing rotted floorboards in the cabin when I heard it. The unmistakable rhythmic, mechanical sound of machinery running somewhere in the woods behind the house. It was a steady, churning sound, like a pump or some kind of motor. But when I went to investigate, following the sound deeper into the hollow, it would move, always staying just beyond my line of sight. The noise would fade as I approached, then start up again from a different direction, leading me in circles through the thick underbrush until I was thoroughly lost and had to use my phone's GPS to find my way back to the cabin. That night, camping in my tent beside the truck since the cabin wasn't yet habitable, I was awakened by voices. At first, I thought it might be other campers or perhaps hunters passing through, but as I listened more carefully, the conversations didn't make sense. The voices were speaking in the thick, archaic mountain dialect of my grandfather's generation, discussing things like the feds coming up the ridge and hiding the copper in the root cellar. The speakers seemed to be moving around the old distillery ruins, and occasionally I could see the faint, flickering dance of what looked like lantern light through the trees. But whenever I worked up the courage to investigate, the voices would stop and the lights would disappear, leaving me standing alone in the suffocating darkness with nothing but the whisper of wind through the leaves. The breakthrough came during my 5th visit, when I decided to do some serious excavation around the distillery ruins. Using a metal detector I'd borrowed from a friend, I started systematically sweeping the area where the main still building had once stood. The device went crazy near what had been the northeast corner, beeping frantically over a section of ground that Lou cleared. It cared no different from any other. I grabbed my shovel and started digging, expecting to find more copper piping or maybe some old equipment that had been buried over the years. Instead, I found bones. Human bones, partially wrapped in what had once been clothing, but was now little more than rotted, earth-stained fabric. The skeleton was incomplete. The skull was missing, and several of the major bones showed clear signs of trauma, deep gouges in the ribs, fractures in the femur, damage that spoke of brutal violence rather than a natural death. Beside the remains were the charred fragments of what looked like identification papers and a corroded metal badge that, once cleaned, revealed the words Internal Revenue Service beneath decades of rust and corrosion. I immediately stopped digging and called the county sheriff's office, but the response I got was not what I expected. Deputy Sarah Jenkins arrived within an hour, but instead of treating it as a crime scene, she seemed more interested in convincing me to rebury the bones and forget what I'd found. "That's Federal Agent Marcus Hoffman," she said matter-of-factly, as if she'd been expecting this discovery for years. "Went missing in 1927 while investigating illegal distilling operations in this hollow. Everyone in these parts knows the story, but ain't nobody ever talked about it officially." According to Deputy Jenkins, Agent Hoffman had been part of a federal task force sent to shut down the moonshine operations that had made this particular hollow notorious throughout the 1920s. The operation here had been run by a man named Silas Crenshaw, who was known for his violent protection of his territory and his willingness to kill anyone who threatened his business. When Hoffman came up the mountain alone one October night in 1927, planning to gather evidence for a raid, he walked into a trap that Crenshaw had been preparing for weeks. Story goes that Crenshaw caught Hoffman snooping around the still and beat him near to death with a hammer. Jenkins continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Then he threw the body into the furnace they used to heat the mash, burned him along with all his identification. But something went wrong during the burning. Maybe the fire wasn't hot enough, or maybe there was divine intervention, because Agent Hoffman's spirit never left this place. Crenshaw died less than a month later, found at the bottom of his own still with his skull caved in and his body burned beyond recognition. The deputy's story explained a lot about what I'd been experiencing, but it also raised new questions. If Silas Crenshaw had died in 1927, who was responsible for the activity I'd been witnessing? Jenkins had an answer for that too, one that made my blood run cold. "Crenshaw's spirit is bound to this place just as much as Agent Hoffman's," she said. "But where Hoffman's ghost is angry about his murder, Crenshaw's spirit is protective of his territory. He's still running moonshine up here, still defending his operation from anyone he sees as a threat. And you, with your renovation plans and your weekend visits, you're stirring up a hornet's nest that's been quiet for decades." That night, I made the mistake of staying on the property despite Jenkins's warnings. I wanted to see for myself what was really happening in those woods, to document whatever paranormal activity might be occurring. I set up a camera near the distillery ruins and positioned myself in the cabin with a clear view of the old still site. As darkness fell, the familiar sounds began. The mechanical churning, the voices calling back and forth, the flicker of lantern light among the trees. But this time, I could see more clearly what was happening. Figures moved through the ruins with purpose and efficiency, translucent forms that glowed with a sickly yellow light. They were setting up equipment, hauling copper piping, arranging what looked like barrels and jugs in precise formations. At the center of the activity was a tall, broad-shouldered man in overalls and a felt hat, directing the operation with the authority of someone who'd done this countless times before. Even at a distance, I could see that his face was wrong, partially melted, as if he'd been caught in a fire that had burned away portions of his flesh and left exposed bone gleaming in the spectral light. The man in overalls, who I now realized had to be Silas Crenshaw, suddenly stopped his work and turned to look directly at the cabin where I was hiding. His ruined face split into a grin that revealed teeth like broken glass, and he raised one massive hand to point in my direction. The other spirits immediately stopped what they were doing and began moving toward the cabin, their forms becoming more solid and menacing as they approached. I could hear their boots on the porch, the creak of floorboards as they entered the house, the whispered conversations as they searched room by room. I barely made it to my truck before they found me, crashing through the front door and stumbling down the collapsed porch as ghostly hands reached through the darkness to grab at my clothes. The engine turned over on the third try, and I gunned it down the mountain road without looking back, my headlights illuminating twisted, malevolent faces in the rearview mirror that seemed to follow me for miles. Behind me, the glow from the hollow grew brighter and brighter, as if the entire mountainside was on fire. I never went back to the property after that night. The next week, I contacted a local real estate agent about selling the land, but she laughed when I told her the location. "Morrison's Hollow," she said. "Honey, that place has been on and off the market for 60 years. Nobody stays there long. Your grandfather was the last person who even tried to make a go of it, and he gave up back in the 50s after his wife left him over what she called the sounds from the ridge." The historical research I did afterward confirmed everything Deputy Jenkins had told me. Silas Crenshaw had indeed been one of the most notorious moonshiners in Tennessee. Federal agent Marcus Hoffman had been investigating him for months before his disappearance, and his case file, which I obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request, contained detailed maps of the hollow and descriptions of the distillery that matched exactly what I'd found. But it was the final entry in Hoffman's reports that gave me chills. Written just 2 days before his disappearance, it read, "Crenshaw operation larger than anticipated. Evidence suggests supernatural protection of site. Local informants refuse to provide intelligence. Claim hollow is cursed ground. Commend extreme caution in approach. Something unnatural guards this place." I sold the property 6 months later to a developer from Knoxville who planned to turn it into a hunting lodge. The sale closed in April, and by June, construction crews were reporting the same phenomena I'd experienced. 3 workers quit after claiming they'd seen burned men walking through the trees, and the project was abandoned by late summer. Today, Morrison's Hollow sits empty once again. 43 acres of cursed ground where the dead still tend their stills and protect their territory from the living. Local hunters give it a wide berth. Sometimes on clear autumn nights, people in Gatlinburg claim they can smell corn mash cooking somewhere up in the mountains. The local sheriff's department doesn't investigate these reports anymore, having learned long ago that some operations are better left undisturbed. Because in the hollows of Appalachia, the dead don't always rest easy, especially when they died protecting something they valued more than their own lives. And somewhere up in those dark woods, Silas Crenshaw is still making moonshine, still defending his territory, and still burning anyone foolish enough to threaten his operation. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I'm an experienced solo hiker. I've spent over a decade exploring trails throughout the southeastern United States, and I've always prided myself on my preparedness and my ability to navigate the wilderness. But what happened to me in October of 2021, during what should have been a routine backpacking trip through the Great Smoky Mountains, challenged everything I thought I knew about survival and the spirits that watch over lost travelers. I'd planned a 4-day solo trek through the backcountry, following a route that would take me from Klingman's Dome to the remote Hazel Creek area. The weather forecast was perfect. I carried enough food and water for 5 days, a GPS unit with backup batteries, detailed topographic maps, and all the standard emergency gear. The trouble began on my second day, when I took what I thought was a shortcut. The path looked well established, marked with the same type of blazes as official park trails. But as I walked, the blazes became less frequent, and the path began to fade until I realized I was following nothing more than a deer trail, leading me deeper into uncharted wilderness. By the time I understood my mistake, the sun was low, and my GPS unit was showing nothing but a green screen. I made camp, planning to retrace my steps in the morning. But when dawn broke, every path I'd taken the day before seemed to have vanished. That's when I first saw her, an elderly woman dressed in simple mountain clothing, who appeared on a ridge about 50 yards away, watching me with a patient attention. She looked to be in her 70s or 80s, with long grey hair braided down her back and clothing that seemed to belong to an earlier era. When she saw that I'd noticed her, she raised one hand in a brief wave, then turned and began walking along the ridge. My first instinct was relief. I called out to her and started climbing toward the ridge, but by the time I reached the spot, she was nowhere to be seen. All I found were faint footprints in the soft earth, impressions that looked fresh but were already beginning to fade as I watched. I spent that day trying to follow various ridgelines and creek beds, but the forest seemed to shift around me. Paths disappeared, and ridges led to impassable cliffs. By evening, I was forced to admit that I was thoroughly lost. As I set up camp for my second night, the elderly woman appeared again, this time standing at the edge of my small clearing. "You're a long way from where you meant to be," she said, her voice carrying the thick mountain accent of the region, but with an odd quality that seemed to come from all directions at once. These mountains don't give up their secrets easily. I tried to approach her, but as I stepped away from my fire, she began backing away. "Can't come too close just yet," she said. "You're not ready to see me as I really am. But I can help you find your way if you're willing to trust someone who knows these mountains better than any map." Over the following day, the woman became my guide, though she maintained her mysterious distance. I would see her on distant ridges, pointing in directions I should travel, or standing beside creek crossings to indicate safe places to ford. Sometimes her guidance seemed to make no sense, leading me away from easy paths toward difficult routes. But I gradually began to understand that her seemingly irrational directions were keeping me safe from dangers I couldn't see. When she led me away from an inviting trail, I later discovered that it ended at a 100-foot cliff. On my third night, she appeared closer than ever before, sitting on a fallen log just outside the circle of firelight. I could see her more clearly now. Her clothing was handmade, in styles that hadn't been common for decades. Her boots were of a type I'd only seen in museums. "You're wondering who I am," she said. "My name is Alice MacLeod, and I've been walking these mountains since before your great-grandmother was born. I came here from the Scottish Highlands in 1847. My husband and I built a cabin in a hollow about 5 miles from where you're sitting right now." As she spoke, I realized I was receiving a first-hand account of Appalachian history from someone who'd actually lived it. She and her husband had learned mountain survival skills from their Cherokee neighbors. "My husband died in 1892, she continued. "My children had grown and moved on. I could have gone with them, but these hills had become more home to me than Scotland ever was. I stayed here until my body wore out in 1934, and even then, I couldn't bear it. To leave. Too many people get lost in these mountains. Good people who just need someone to show them the safe paths home." The truth settled over me. Alice MacLeod was a spirit, the ghost of a mountain woman who had chosen to remain in the place she loved, using her knowledge to help lost travelers. She was what the Cherokee had called a guardian spirit. "But why help me?" I asked. "Because you remind me of myself when I was your age," she said. Independent, capable, but also because these mountains are changing. There are things moving through the wilderness now that weren't here in my time. Dark entities that feed on fear and confusion. I guide people like you away from those dangerous paths. As if to emphasize her point, a howl echoed through the forest, a sound that wasn't from any animal I recognized. That's what I've been keeping you away from, she said, her posture tense. Something that's been stalking you since you first got lost, waiting for you to wander into its territory. The howl came again, closer this time, answered by similar calls from other directions. I was surrounded. As the calls continued through the night, Alice maintained a protective vigil around my camp, her form becoming more visible and solid as she drew upon whatever spiritual energy allowed her to interact with the physical world. When morning came, the threatening sounds had faded, and Alice announced that it was time for me to find my way home. The main trail is about 2 miles southeast of here, she said, pointing toward a ridge that looked no different from any of the others surrounding us. Follow the creek down this hollow until you reach a stone bridge, then take the path that heads uphill to your left. You'll reach the parking area at Cataloochee Falls before noon. I wanted to thank her, to ask more questions about her life and her ongoing presence in the mountains, to understand the nature of the dark things she protected travelers from. But as the sun rose higher, her form began to fade, the edges blurring until she was little more than a shimmer in the morning light. Will I see you again? I called out as she became increasingly transparent. These mountains are my home, her voice replied, though I could no longer see her clearly. It was a whisper on the wind, a rustle in the leaves. I'm always here for those who truly need help, but be more careful in the future. Not every spirit in these wilderness areas is as friendly as I am. I followed her directions exactly and found the stone bridge and the trail she had described. Within 3 hours, I was back at my car, exhausted but safe, with a story that I knew most people would never believe. But I also carried with me a new understanding of the Appalachian wilderness, a place where the boundary between the living and the dead was thinner than most people realized, where protective spirits still watched over travelers who showed proper respect for the power and mystery of the mountains. I've returned to the Smokies many times since that experience, always being more careful about staying on marked trails and being properly prepared for emergencies. But I've also learned to recognize the signs of a benevolent spiritual presence in the wilderness, the sudden, inexplicable sense of being watched by kind eyes, the subtle, intuitive guidance that steers you away from a dangerous-looking path, the feeling that someone who knows these mountains better than any living person is looking out for your safety. I never saw Alice MacLeod again, in the form I'd encountered during my 3 days of being lost, but I have felt her presence during subsequent hiking trips, especially when weather or terrain created potentially dangerous conditions. A sudden shift in the wind that warned of an approaching storm, an inexplicable reluctance to follow a certain path that later proved to lead to a hazardous, washed-out area. And on one occasion, the distinct impression of someone walking silently alongside me during a particularly difficult river crossing that required all my attention and skill. The Great Smoky Mountains are home to many spirits, both benevolent and malevolent, remnants of the countless people who've lived and died in these ancient hills over thousands of years. Some, like Ailis, chose to remain as guardians and guides for those who venture into the wilderness with respect and proper preparation. Others, the entities she'd protected me from, prey upon the lost and the frightened, feeding on fear and confusion in ways that can lead to far worse fates than simply being unable to find the trail back to civilization. But for hikers who show proper respect for the mountains and the spirits that call them home, the Smokies offer protection as well as challenge, guidance as well as wilderness. Alice MacLeod and others like her continue their vigil over the trails and ridges they knew in life, ensuring that those who truly need help will find it, even when it comes from sources that official maps and guidebooks will never acknowledge or explain. My name is David Hawkins, and I'm a photographer who specializes in documenting the abandoned buildings of the Appalachian region. I've spent years capturing images of forgotten places, empty coal camps, derelict mills, and silent churches that stand as monuments to communities that no longer exist. In the summer of 2020, while driving through a remote section of the North Georgia mountains, I discovered Harmony Baptist Church, a small wooden structure sitting in a clearing that seemed frozen in time. What I thought would be a routine photography session turned into an encounter with the darkest chapter in the region's religious history. The church sat at the end of a narrow gravel road that branched off from a barely maintained county route. I'd found the location by studying old survey maps. The building itself was a classic example of 1940s mountain church architecture: white clapboard siding, a simple steeple, and tall windows that would have filled the interior with light. Despite being abandoned for decades, the structure was in remarkably good condition, as if someone had been maintaining it. The surrounding cemetery told a different story. Dozens of weathered headstones dotted the hillside. What struck me immediately was how many of the graves bore the same date of death: October 15th, 1953. Men, women, and children, entire families buried on the same day. The mathematics of mortality suggested either an epidemic or a catastrophe. As I photographed the exterior, I noticed details that didn't match its otherwise pristine condition. The front doors were secured with a heavy, new-looking chain and padlock, and all the windows had been boarded up from the inside. Posted near the entrance were official notices warning people to stay away due to structural hazards. It was while I was examining the headstones that I first heard it, the faint sound of singing coming from inside the church. The melody was a traditional hymn, Amazing Grace, sung in the four-part harmony typical of mountain church services. At first, I assumed it was a radio, but as I listened more carefully, I realized I was hearing multiple distinct voices singing together. The singing continued for about 20 minutes, followed by the rhythmic cadence of a preacher's voice delivering a sermon. I couldn't make out the words, but the rise and fall of the speaker's delivery was unmistakably that of an old-style mountain preacher. Occasionally, I could hear responses from the congregation, "Amen," and "Praise the Lord." Driven by curiosity, I walked around the building, looking for a way to see inside. On the backside, I discovered a small section of foundation where the boards had warped enough to create a gap about 6 inches wide. By lying flat on the ground and positioning my camera at the right angle, I was able to get a limited view of the church interior. What I saw through that narrow opening challenged everything I thought I knew. The interior of Harmony Baptist Church was fully lit, as if by unseen electricity. The pews were filled with people dressed in the simple Sunday clothes of the 1950s. Men in dark suits, women in conservative dresses, children sitting beside their parents, all listening to a tall, thin preacher at the pulpit. But there was something terribly wrong. The people in the pews sat too still, their posture too perfect. They never shifted, never coughed, never whispered. Most disturbing of all, none of them seemed to be breathing. I managed to take several photographs before the service ended, and the singing began again. As the final notes faded, the congregation began filing out through the front doors. I scrambled to my feet and ran around to the front, expecting to see people emerging. The doors remained chained shut. The parking lot was empty except for my own vehicle. Yet I could still hear the sounds of people talking and calling out to each other, their voices growing fainter as they disappeared into the forest. That evening, I drove into Dahlonega to research the history of Harmony Baptist Church. What I learned explained both the mysterious service and the tragic dates on the headstones. The church had been established in 1925 by a charismatic preacher named Ezekiel Morrison, who preached that the faithful would be taken up bodily into paradise, but only if they demonstrated their complete surrender by participating in what he called the final sacrament. The end came on Sunday, October 15th, 1953. During what Morrison told his congregation would be their last earthly service, he had prepared a communion service using bread and wine laced with enough strychnine to kill everyone in the church. 43 people died that morning, including Morrison himself, in what was officially classified as a mass murder-suicide. But the historical records also contained details the official investigation had downplayed. Witnesses from neighboring communities reported that the church bell had continued ringing every Sunday for months after the tragedy. Hunters and hikers reported hearing hymn singing from the abandoned church. Most disturbing were the accounts from family members of the deceased who claimed to have encountered their dead relatives, spirits who insisted they were not dead, but had simply moved to a different kind of service. Armed with this knowledge, I returned to the church the following Sunday. At exactly 11 o'clock, the church bell began to ring. As it rang, I watched in fascination and fear as translucent figures began materializing in the cemetery, rising from the graves themselves. Men, women, and children in their Sunday best, all moving with a purposeful stride toward the church. They walked through the locked doors as if they were made of nothing more than air. This time, I was prepared with equipment sensitive enough to capture what my eyes couldn't fully process. Using a digital audio recorder and a camera with infrared capabilities, I documented nearly 2 hours of activity. The photographs showed the church interior filled with transparent figures. The audio recordings captured not just the hymns, but Morrison's sermon. He was still promising them that their faithful gathering would soon be rewarded with translation to heaven. They were trapped in an eternal loop, forever reliving the final moments before Morrison's ultimate betrayal. I made one final visit the following Sunday. This time, I brought printed copies of newspaper articles detailing the truth about the mass murder. As the ghostly service began, I approached the building and began reading the historical accounts aloud, my voice carrying through the walls. The hymn singing faltered and stopped, replaced by confused murmuring, as Morrison's victims began to understand the true nature of their deaths. Through the walls, I could hear Morrison's voice rising in panic as he tried to maintain control. But his authority was broken. One by one, the voices of his followers rose in anger and accusation. The confrontation lasted for nearly an hour. When it finally ended, the silence that followed was different. It was the peaceful silence of resolution. Since that Sunday, Harmony Baptist Church has remained truly abandoned. The building still stands, but the phantom services have ended. The spirits of Ezekiel Morrison's congregation have finally found the salvation their preacher promised, but failed to deliver. A salvation that came through truth and justice, not poison and false prophecy. My name is Rachel Torres, and I work as a geological surveyor for the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection. Part of my job, the part that takes me to the forgotten corners of the state, involves inspecting old mining sites to ensure they're properly sealed and pose no environmental hazards. In September of 2020, I was assigned to investigate the old Black Rock mine near the town of Bramwell, a coal extraction site that had been officially closed since 1902, following a catastrophic collapse that killed dozens of workers. What I discovered there, in the suffocating darkness beneath the earth, challenged everything I thought I knew about the boundary between the living and the dead. The drive to Black Rock took me deep into the mountains of McDowell County, through a countryside that bore the deep weeping scars of over a century of coal mining. Abandoned tipples dotted the landscape like the skeletal remains of forgotten beasts, and the creeks ran a sickly chemical orange with acid mine drainage that had been seeping from old workings for generations. The closer I got to the Black Rock site, the more desolate the terrain became. The trees grew stunted and sparse, their leaves yellowed even in early autumn, and the few houses I passed looked abandoned, their windows boarded up like blind eyes. The mine entrance itself was located at the end of a rutted dirt road that climbed steadily for 3 miles through a hollow so narrow that sunlight barely penetrated to the forest floor. According to my files, the site had been sealed with concrete and steel barriers in 1923, then reinforced again in 1965, and most recently in 1994. But as my truck rounded the final bend and the mine portal came into view, I could immediately see that something was terribly wrong. The concrete barrier that should have completely blocked the entrance had a gap in it. Not a small crack from settling or weather damage, but a deliberate man-sized opening that looked like it had been carefully maintained over many years. I parked my truck and approached the entrance with a growing sense of unease. The gap in the barrier was too precise to be accidental, its edges smooth, as if someone had been regularly clearing away debris and vegetation to keep it open. Fresh footprints in the mud around the entrance showed that people had been visiting this site recently, despite the numerous faded warning signs posted by state and federal mining agencies. But what disturbed me most was the sound coming from inside the mine, a faint chorus of voices that seemed to rise and fall like a children's choir practicing in the distance. My initial assumption was that local kids had been using the mine as a hangout, a dangerous, foolish game. Abandoned mines are death traps, filled with toxic gases, unstable ground, and hidden shafts that can drop hundreds of feet into flooded tunnels. I called out toward the entrance, my voice sounding small and thin against the vast silence of the hollow. "This is a state inspector. Anyone in there needs to come out immediately." The voices stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete it seemed to press against my eardrums. Then, after several long, tense minutes, the singing resumed. But now it sounded different. Sadder, more distant, as if the singers were moving deeper into the mountain. I should have left immediately to call for backup from the state police. But something about those voices, their pure, haunting melody, compelled me to investigate further. They were definitely children's voices, but there was something wrong with the song they were singing. It wasn't any tune I recognized, but rather a mournful, wordless dirge that seemed to speak of loss and longing in a way that made my chest tighten with an inexplicable sadness. Against every safety protocol I'd ever learned, I grabbed my flashlight and safety equipment and squeezed through the gap in the barrier. The tunnel beyond stretched into absolute darkness, its walls supported by rotting timbers that creaked ominously in the slight, cold breeze that flowed from the depths. The air was damp and carried the metallic taste of iron and the acrid smell of sulfur compounds that indicated dangerous gas concentrations. But mixed with these industrial odors was something else. The faint, ghostly scent of wood smoke and kerosene, as if someone had been burning old-fashioned lamps deep in the mine. The children's voices continued to echo from somewhere ahead, their song weaving through the darkness like a thread I couldn't help but follow. As I moved deeper into the mine, my flashlight beam revealed evidence of recent human activity that made no sense. Fresh candle wax pooled on rock ledges, and someone had arranged small stones into neat, deliberate piles at regular intervals along the tunnel walls. Most disturbing were the toys scattered throughout the passageway. A wooden horse with a missing wheel, a corn husk doll, a handful of marbles, and other playthings that looked handmade and decades old. They were positioned as if children had been playing with them just moments before, but the toys themselves belonged to an earlier, harder era. About 200 yards into the mine, the main tunnel branched into several smaller passages. The singing was coming from the passage on my right, accompanied now by other sounds, the scrape of small feet on stone, the whisper of cloth brushing against rock walls, and occasionally what sounded like muffled laughter or crying. I followed the sounds deeper into the mine, my flashlight beam dancing across walls that showed the crude tool marks of pick-and-shovel excavation from over a century ago. The passage ended into a natural cavern that had been enlarged by the miners, its ceiling supported by massive wooden posts that somehow still looked solid despite their age. But what stopped me cold, what made the air freeze in my lungs, was what I saw in the center of the chamber. Dozens of small figures sat in a circle on the cavern floor, their forms translucent and shimmering in my flashlight beam like heat mirages. They appeared to be children, ranging in age from perhaps 6 to 14, dressed in the simple patched work clothes of early 20th century mining families. They were singing in voices that seemed to come from both everywhere and nowhere, their melody rising and falling in harmonies that no human throat could produce. As my light played across their faces, I realized with a dawning, sickening horror that many of them showed signs of terrible injury. Some had crushed skulls or missing limbs. Others bore the black marks of coal dust permanently embedded in their skin, and several appeared to have died from the kind of lung disease that came from breathing coal dust for years. These weren't living children playing in an abandoned mine. They were the spirits of the young people who had died here, trapped forever in the darkness where their short, brutal lives had ended. As I stood frozen in shock, one of the children, a boy who couldn't have been more than 10 years old, looked up from the circle and made eye contact with me. His face was as pale as limestone, and when he smiled, a sad, hesitant expression, I could see that several of his teeth were missing, knocked out by some long-ago accident. He raised one translucent hand and beckoned for me to join their circle, his mouth moving as if he were speaking, though I could hear nothing but the continued, heartbreaking singing from the group. That's when the truth of what had happened here crashed over me like a physical blow. These weren't just the spirits of children who had died in the mine. They were child laborers, boys and girls who had worked in these tunnels alongside the adult miners because their families needed every penny they could earn to survive. In 1902, when the Black Rock mine collapsed, it hadn't just killed grown men with families. It had also crushed dozens of children who should have been in school, instead of crawling through narrow passages to retrieve coal cars or operating dangerous equipment in spaces too small for adult workers. The boy who had beckoned to me stood up from the circle and began walking toward me, his movement silent despite the rocky floor. As he approached, I could see the coal dust ground so deeply into his skin that it formed permanent black tattoos across his arms and face. His overalls were torn and bloody from cave-ins and accidents that had occurred over a century ago. But his eyes held a kindness that was heartbreaking in its innocence. When he reached me, he opened his mouth and spoke, though his voice seemed to come from the walls of the cavern itself, rather than from his translucent form. "We've been waiting so long," he said, his words carrying the thick Appalachian accent of his era. "Nobody ever comes to see us anymore. Nobody remembers we were here." Behind him, the other children had stopped singing and were now looking at me with expressions of desperate hope, as if my presence offered some possibility of relief from their eternal imprisonment in the darkness. "We didn't mean to die," continued a girl who looked to be about 12, her voice joining the boys in that strange, disembodied ventriloquism that seemed to emanate from the mine itself. "We were just trying to help our families. Papa said we had to work or we'd all starve, but the mountain fell on us, and now we can't go home." Tears that glowed with their own pale, ethereal light traced clean tracks through the coal dust on her cheeks. I wanted to speak, to offer some comfort to these lost, broken children, but my throat had closed with a grief so profound it felt like I was choking on it. The injustice of their situation, children forced to work in deadly conditions, then forgotten by history when they died, overwhelmed me completely. As I struggled to find words, more children began approaching from the shadows at the edges of the cavern. Some walked normally, others limped from injuries that would never heal, and a few crawled because their legs had been crushed beyond use. But all of them looked at me with the same desperate hope, the same heartbreaking longing for acknowledgement and remembrance. The boy who had first approached me reached out with one ghostly hand and touched my arm. The contact was cold beyond description, a chill that seemed to seep into my very bones, but it wasn't unpleasant. It was more like being touched by morning mist than by anything solid. "Will you tell people about us?" he asked, his voice a plea that echoed through the cavern and through my soul. "Will you let them know we were real, that we mattered?" His request was so simple, so heartbreaking in its humility, that I finally found my voice. "Yes," I whispered, the word echoing through the cavern like a solemn promise. "I'll tell everyone. You won't be forgotten anymore." As soon as I spoke those words, the children's expressions changed from desperation to something approaching a fragile, tentative peace. Their translucent forms became even more faded, as if my promise had begun to release them from their earthly bonds. One by one, the children began to fade away, but not before each of them approached me to whisper their name and age at the time of their death. Tommy Henderson, age 8. Mary Catherine Burke, age 11. James Russell Morgan, age 13. Samuel Davis, age 7. The litany continued until nearly 4 dozen names had been spoken, each one burning itself into my memory with a perfect, searing clarity. As the last child faded from view, the cavern fell completely silent for the first time since I'd entered the mine. I made my way back to the entrance in a daze, my mind reeling from what I'd experienced. Once I reached my truck, the sunlight feeling alien and strange after the profound darkness of the mine, I immediately began researching the history of the Black Rock Mine, using every database and archive I could access on my laptop. What I found confirmed the children's stories in heartbreaking detail. The mine collapse of October 15, 1902, had indeed killed 43 people, including 28 children between the ages of 7 and 15. The official records listed them as workers, a cold, clinical term that erased their childhood. But contemporary newspaper accounts revealed the truth. They were child laborers, their small bodies and nimble fingers exploited by a system that valued coal more than their lives. Their families had been desperate enough to send them into the mines despite the obvious dangers. The mine had been sealed not just for safety reasons, but because the local community wanted to forget what had happened there. The use of child labor in the mines was an open secret that everyone participated in, but no one wanted to acknowledge publicly. When the children died, they were buried quickly and quietly in unmarked graves, their deaths attributed to industrial accidents that were presented as unavoidable tragedies rather than the preventable results of corporate greed and family desperation. I included everything I'd learned in my official report to the state, recommending that the mine be properly and permanently sealed, but also that a memorial be erected to honor the children who had died there. The memorial was dedicated 6 months later, a simple granite marker bearing all 43 names and ages, along with an inscription that read, "In memory of the children of Black Rock Mine, whose short lives ended in darkness, but whose courage lights the way for future generations." Since the memorial was installed, local residents report that the children's voices are no longer heard from the mine. The entrance has been permanently sealed with a concrete barrier that shows no signs of mysterious gaps or maintenance. Flowers appear regularly at the memorial, left by visitors who come to pay their respects to children who died over a century ago, but are finally being remembered and honored as they deserve to be all along. But sometimes, especially on quiet autumn evenings when the mist rises from the hollows, hikers in the area report hearing faint voices singing somewhere in the distance. Not the mournful tune I heard in the mine, but something lighter and happier, like children at play in fields where the sun always shines, and no mountain can ever fall on them again. The children of Black Rock Mine found their peace at last. Not through forgetting, but through remembrance. Not through denial of their suffering, but through the acknowledgement of their worth and dignity as human beings who deserved better than the world they were born into. My name is Michael Sutton, and my family has owned 300 acres of mountainside in the Blue Ridge region of North Carolina for 5 generations. The property includes dense hardwood forest, 2 clear, cold mountain streams, and what the locals call Devil's Ridge, a narrow spine of granite that runs along our eastern boundary like the backbone of some ancient, sleeping giant. It was along this ridge that we discovered the trail that shouldn't have existed, a path maintained by hands that belonged to no living person. I first noticed the path during a boundary survey in the early spring of 2021. My father had passed the previous winter, leaving me to sort through decades of property records and survey maps that painted a confusing picture of exactly where our land began and ended. Armed with a GPS unit and copies of deeds dating back to the 1890s, I set out to walk the perimeter and settle the boundaries once and for all. The eastern section along Devil's Ridge was supposed to be impenetrable forest, a thick, tangled wall of mountain laurel and rhododendron. But as I climbed toward the ridgeline, I discovered a clearly defined trail cutting through the undergrowth like a knife through butter. The path was roughly 4 feet wide and appeared to have been recently maintained. Someone had carefully pruned back the laurel branches, cleared fallen logs, and even laid flat stones across the muddy sections to create a walkable surface. But according to every map I'd studied, this trail didn't exist. The last official path through this section of the mountains had been abandoned in the 1960s, and it had followed a completely different route through the valley below. Yet, here was a trail that looked like it received regular maintenance, winding up the mountainside with the kind of confident, knowing curves that spoke of someone who knew these mountains intimately. Curiosity got to the better of my caution, and I decided to follow the path to see where it led. The trail climbed steadily through stands of old-growth oak and poplar, their massive trunks creating a cathedral-like atmosphere that felt both peaceful and somehow watchful. Every 100 yards or so, I encountered something that made me stop and examine my surroundings more carefully. Small piles of stones had been arranged in precise patterns beside the trail. Not the random cairns left by hikers, but deliberate constructions that looked almost like altars or markers. Each pile consisted of exactly 13 stones arranged in a spiral pattern, with a larger central stone that had been carved with symbols I didn't recognize. As I climbed higher, the markers became more elaborate. Bundles of dried herbs hung from tree branches at regular intervals, filling the air with the sharp, clean scents of sage, rosemary, and other plants I couldn't identify. The herbs were fresh enough that their aromatic oils still perfumed the mountain air, suggesting they'd been placed recently. Strips of cloth in deep red and black had been tied to certain trees, always at eye level, and always on trees that showed signs of careful tending, their bark cleaned of moss and lichen. The trail eventually led to a clearing near the top of Devil's Ridge, a circular meadow about 50 feet across that felt like stepping into another world entirely. The grass here grew in perfect concentric circles, each ring a slightly different shade of green, creating a natural mandala that was too precise to be accidental. At the center of the clearing stood an ancient oak tree, unlike any I'd ever seen. Its trunk was easily 8 feet in diameter, and its branches spread out in perfectly symmetrical patterns that seemed to defy the random growth typical of forest trees. The bark was covered with carved symbols, some that looked like letters from alphabets I didn't recognize, others that were geometric patterns that seemed to shift and change depending on the angle from which you viewed them. Around the base of the great oak, someone had arranged a circle of flat stones, each about the size of a dinner plate, and carved with individual symbols that matched those on the tree trunk. Between the stones, small offerings had been placed, bundles of wildflowers, polished river rocks, carved pieces of wood that looked like miniature totems or protective charms. Everything was fresh and carefully arranged, as if someone visited this place regularly to tend to its maintenance. I photographed everything I could, then made my way back down the trail with more questions than answers. That evening, I drove into the nearest town to visit Elmira Patterson, an elderly woman who'd grown up in these mountains and served as the unofficial historian for our corner of Appalachia. When I described what I'd found on Devil's Ridge, her reaction was immediate and intense. "Lord have mercy," she whispered, her weathered hands gripping the arms of her rocking chair until her knuckles went white. "You found Granny Blackwood's trail. I was hoping that path had finally grown over and been forgotten." She looked at me with eyes that held a mixture of fear and profound respect. "Michael, you need to stay away from that place. Granny Blackwood's been gone for 30 years, but her trail stays open because she ain't really gone. Not completely." According to Mrs. Patterson, Eliza Blackwood had been what the mountain people called a root woman, someone who practiced the old folk magic that had been brought to Appalachia by Scottish and Irish immigrants centuries ago. Granny Blackwood had lived alone on Devil's Ridge from the 1940s until her death in 1991, surviving on her knowledge of herbal medicine, weather prediction, and what the locals carefully referred to as the old ways. People came to her from all over the region, seeking remedies for ailments that conventional medicine couldn't cure, predictions about the weather, and occasionally for help with more serious problems that required what she called deeper workings. Granny Blackwood wasn't evil, Mrs. Patterson was careful to explain. She helped a lot of folks over the years, but she was powerful in ways that made people nervous, and toward the end of her life she started talking about making sure her knowledge wouldn't die with her, about finding a way to keep the old protections active even after she was gone. The trail I discovered was Granny Blackwood's sacred path, the route she'd used for 50 years to access her working spaces and tend to the spiritual protection she'd placed around the mountain. The symbols were protective wards. The most disturbing part of Mrs. Patterson's account was her description of Granny Blackwood's final years. As her death approached, the old woman had become obsessed with ensuring the continuity of her protective work. She'd spent months performing increasingly complex rituals designed to bind her spirit to the mountain itself, creating what she called a watching presence that would maintain her wards long after her physical death. The last time anyone had seen her alive, she'd been walking up the trail toward Devil's Ridge, carrying a satchel of mysterious items and muttering about the final working. They found her body 3 days later at the base of that big oak tree. Natural causes, the coroner said. But the folks who found her said she looked peaceful, like she'd accomplished something important. And ever since then, Mrs. Patterson concluded, the trails stayed clear, the markers stay fresh, and the protection she set up still works. Granny Blackwood's still up there, Michael, still doing her work. And you don't want to interfere with something like that. Despite the warnings, I found myself drawn back to the trail repeatedly. Each time I noticed subtle changes, fresh herbs hanging from branches, new stones added to the cairns. The trail itself seemed to adapt. After a heavy rain that should have caused washouts, I'd returned to find new stones laid and drainage channels cleared. My closest encounter came one late autumn evening. I'd climbed to the sacred clearing at sunset. As I worked with my camera, the temperature dropped, and a thick mist rose from the forest floor, enveloping me. That's when I heard her voice, an elderly woman speaking in the thick mountain dialect of a bygone era, her words seeming to come from the mist itself. "You're Jacob Sutton's boy," the voice said. Not a question, but a statement. "Your great-grandmother brought you to see me when you were just a baby, sick with a fever that wouldn't break. I remember you." I tried to respond, but the words stuck in my throat as a figure began to materialize in the mist near the base of the oak tree. She was tall and lean, dressed in the simple mountain clothing of an earlier era, her hair as white as mountain snow. "Don't be afraid, child," Granny Blackwood's spirit said, her voice gentle but filled with an undeniable authority. "I mean no harm to your family or your land. I'm just maintaining the old agreements. But you've been walking my trail, disturbing my workings, and that's going to cause problems if it continues." She gestured toward the carved symbols on the oak tree, which were now glowing with a faint blue light. "These protections require careful tending. Your presence here is like dropping stones in a still pond. The ripples spread out and affect things you can't see or understand." Her form was translucent, like looking at someone through clear water, but her presence felt completely real, completely solid. "I'm going to offer you a choice," she said. "You can continue to use this trail, but only if you're willing to learn what it means to walk it properly. I'll teach you the old ways, show you how to tend the protections. It's knowledge your family once had but forgot. Or you can stay away from this path and trust that some things are better left to those who understand them." The weight of her offer settled over me. I was being invited into something far older and more significant than I could have imagined. After a long moment, I made my decision. "I want to learn," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Granny Blackwood's spirit smiled, and the mist around us seemed to glow with a warm, golden light. "Then we'll begin with the next full moon," she said. "Come to the clearing at midnight. Bring offerings of local wildflowers and spring water. But understand this. Once you begin learning the old ways, you'll be responsible for continuing the work. This knowledge doesn't come without obligations." The mist dissipated as quickly as it had formed, and her spirit faded with it. Over the following months, I returned to the clearing at each full moon, learning to read the subtle signs of the mountain's spiritual ecosystem, understanding the purpose behind the symbols and markers, and gradually taking on more responsibility for maintaining the protections Granny Blackwood had established. The trail remains active today, But now I understand it was never just a hiking path. It's a working space, a sacred route connecting the human world to older powers. Granny Blackwood continues her work, but now she has a living partner to tend to the physical aspects of the trail while she handles the spiritual dimensions. The old agreements remain in force, the balance is maintained, and the community continues to benefit from protections most people never realize exist. Sometimes, when I'm working alone on the trail, I catch glimpses of other figures in the forest, previous generations of route workers and mountain-wise folk still continuing their protective work beyond death. The tradition is older than any of us realized, and Granny Blackwood was just the most recent keeper of the knowledge that connects our world to the ancient watching heart of the mountains. My name is Rebecca Chen, and in the spring of 2020, my husband Mark and I purchased 47 acres of remote mountain property in the Blue Ridge region of Virginia. We'd been looking for a weekend retreat where we could escape the pressures of city life, and the realtor had described our new land as pristine wilderness with natural limestone caves perfect for exploration. What we discovered beneath our property was anything but natural, and the exploration we undertook led us into the violent, bloody history of Prohibition-era bootlegging, a history that some spirits were determined to keep buried. The entrance to the cave system was located about a quarter-mile from our cabin, hidden behind a thick grove of mountain laurel that had grown up around what looked like a natural opening in the limestone bedrock. According to the geological survey included with our property documents, the caves extended for several hundred yards into the mountainside. As amateur spelunkers, Mark and I were excited about having our own private cave system to explore. Our first descent into the caves seemed to confirm everything we'd been told. The main passage was wide enough for two people to walk side by side. The walls showed the smooth, water-worn surfaces typical of limestone caves, and we could hear the sound of running water somewhere deeper in the system. For the first 100 yards, everything looked exactly as it should. But as we went deeper, we began encountering features that didn't belong. The first was a section of passage where the floor had been deliberately leveled and covered with flat stones arranged in a precise pattern. The stonework was clearly man-made. 50 yards further, we discovered our first brick wall. It appeared suddenly in our flashlight beams, a professionally constructed barrier that completely blocked the natural passage. The bricks were old, but well preserved. At a side, the wall contained a wooden door with iron hinges and a heavy lock that had long since rusted into immobility. Mark managed to force the door open, revealing that the brick wall was actually the entrance to a much larger chamber that had been carved out of the natural cave system. The room beyond was roughly circular, about 30 feet in diameter, with a domed ceiling that had been carefully shaped and reinforced with additional stonework. Along the walls, we found the remnants of wooden shelving and storage areas, while the center of the chamber contained the foundations of what had clearly been some kind of manufacturing equipment. We were standing in an underground distillery, a sophisticated bootlegging operation that someone had built into the natural cave system during the Prohibition era. The stonework provided stable foundations, the brick walls offered security, and the constant cave temperature would have been perfect for aging liquor. But it was what we found in the side passages that made our discovery truly unsettling. A smaller chamber adjacent to the main distillery contained what were unmistakably living quarters, the remains of beds, a cook stove, and personal belongings that suggested someone had lived down here for extended periods. Another passage led to a storage area where dozens of wooden crates still held the remnants of glass bottles and ceramic jugs. And in the deepest chamber we discovered, we found evidence that this bootlegging operation had ended in violence. The bones were scattered across the floor of the final chamber, human remains that had been left to decompose in the darkness for nearly a century. 3 complete skeletons lay among the debris of what had clearly been a gun battle, bullet holes in the cave walls, brass cartridge cases scattered across the stone floor, and weapons that had rusted away to little more than metal fragments. One of the skulls showed a massive fracture that spoke of close-range violence, while another had what appeared to be a bullet hole directly through the forehead. As we stood in that grim chamber, the temperature around us began to drop rapidly. Our breath started misting in the suddenly frigid air, and the sounds of our own movement seemed to echo strangely, as if other footsteps were following ours. The beam of my flashlight began flickering, and I could swear I heard voices somewhere in the darkness beyond our position, not conversation, but angry shouting and commands being barked in the harsh tones of men preparing for violence. That's when we saw the first figure moving through the shadows at the edge of our vision. It was tall and lean, dressed in the kind of dark clothing that would have been worn by federal agents during the 1920s, and it carried what looked like a Thompson submachine gun. As we watched in growing terror, more figures materialized around us, some in the simple mountain clothing of local bootleggers, others in the suits and ties of law enforcement officers, all of them bearing the wounds that had killed them. The ghostly figures seemed to be reliving the final moments of whatever confrontation had taken place. We could hear the phantom sounds of gunfire echoing through the passages, the shouts of men calling warnings, the horrible sounds of bullets striking flesh and bone. We were standing in the middle of this spectral battle, invisible to the fighting spirits, but vulnerable to being caught in a crossfire that existed on some plane between the living and the dead. Mark grabbed my hand and we ran, following our guide rope back through the passages. Behind us, the sounds of battle continued to rage, growing louder and more intense, as if our presence had somehow energized the spiritual imprint of violence that permeated the underground complex. We didn't stop running until we reached the cave entrance and emerged into the daylight, gasping and shaking. The next day, I began researching the history of our land. What I discovered was a story of betrayal, violence, and greed. Our property had once belonged to the Mackenzie family, who had turned to bootlegging during Prohibition. Their operation had been one of the most sophisticated in the region, but their success had made them targets. In October of 1929, a federal task force had raided the property, based on information provided by a rival bootlegger named Tommy Sullivan. The raid had turned into a massacre when the federal agents discovered that Sullivan and his men were already in the caves, attempting to steal the Mackenzie family's equipment and liquor. The gun battle that followed had killed everyone involved. 3 federal agents, 4 members of Sullivan's gang, and 2 of the Mackenzie brothers. The survivors of both families had abandoned the property, and the cave entrance had been sealed by authorities. For nearly a century, the underground complex had remained undisturbed, but our discovery had somehow reactivated the ghostly battlefield. Over the following weeks, we began experiencing supernatural activity throughout our property. Tools would disappear. At night, we could hear the sounds of vehicles driving up our access road, followed by the slam of car doors and the voices of men talking in low, urgent tones. But when we investigated, we'd find only tire tracks, kicks that disappeared after a few yards. The most disturbing incidents involved direct encounters with the spirits. Mark was approached one evening by a tall man in a federal agent's suit who identified himself as Agent William Morrison and warned us to stop interfering with ongoing law enforcement operations. I was confronted by a mountain man with a thick Scottish accent who insisted that we were trespassing on Mackenzie family property and needed to leave before the shooting starts again. But it was Tommy Sullivan's spirit that proved to be the most dangerous. Unlike the other ghosts, he appeared to retain full awareness of the present and a deep resentment about our discovery. He began appearing in our cabin at night, standing at the foot of our bed with a malevolent smile. "You've been nosing around where you don't belong," he said during one terrifying encounter. "That operation down there was mine by right of conquest, and I don't appreciate folks disturbing my property." His form was more solid than the others, solid enough to move objects. The next morning, we found a message scratched into the wooden table beside our bed. "Last warning." We left that day, packing our essential belongings and driving back to the city without bothering to lock up. Behind us, we could see lights moving through the forest around the cave entrance, and the sounds of gunfire echoed across the valley. We sold the property 6 months later to a developer who planned to build a vacation resort, but the project was abandoned after construction workers began reporting the same phenomena. The land remains undeveloped today, 47 acres of beautiful mountain property that no one can safely occupy because of the violent spirits that still wage their eternal war in the caves below. The Bootlegger's Tunnel serves as a reminder that some historical conflicts leave scars too deep for time to heal. My name is Michael Torres, and I work as a forest maintenance supervisor for the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. I've spent 12 years managing fire prevention programs in the Allegheny National Forest. In all that time, I thought I understood every aspect of forest management. But what happened at the old Sullivan Township Fire Tower in the summer of 2020 taught me that some duties run deeper than job descriptions, and some responsibilities extend far beyond the boundaries of life and death. The Sullivan Township Fire Tower was built in 1952 on a ridge overlooking nearly 40,000 acres of mixed hardwood forest. For 37 years, it had been manned by dedicated fire watchers. The tower stood 90 feet tall, with a glass-enclosed observation cabin at the top. It had been officially decommissioned in 1989, when the Forest Service transitioned to automated detection systems. The observation cabin had been stripped of its equipment and locked up. According to all official records, no one had been assigned to monitor the Sullivan Township sector from that tower for over 30 years. So when local residents began reporting lights in the tower cabin and the distinctive silhouette of a man climbing the stairs every evening at sunset, the Forest Service dismissed the reports as cases of mistaken identity. But the reports persisted, and they were remarkably consistent. Multiple witnesses described seeing a tall, thin man wearing what appeared to be the standard Forest Service uniform of the 1960s, climbing the tower stairs with the steady, measured pace of someone performing a familiar routine. The figure would disappear into the observation cabin just as full darkness fell, and throughout the night, residents could see the glow of what looked like kerosene lamps moving around inside. Most unsettling were the radio transmissions that ham radio operateurs in the area had begun picking up, detailed weather reports and fire hazard assessments broadcast on frequencies that the Forest Service had stopped using decades earlier. My supervisor assigned me to investigate. The plan was simple. Spend a few nights camped near the tower, document any actual activity, and determine whether we were dealing with trespassers, equipment malfunction, or simply persistent local folklore. I set up my base camp about 200 yards from the tower base. The sun was just touching the western horizon when I saw him. A tall figure emerging from the tree line and approaching the tower with the confident stride of someone who belonged there. He was dressed in the clothing locals had described. He reached the base of the tower and began climbing without hesitation. I trained my binoculars on him and managed to get a clear view of his face. He appeared to be in his 50s, with the weathered features and steady demeanor of someone who'd spent decades working outdoors. His expression was focused and serious, but also peaceful. As he climbed, I noticed details that didn't make sense. He carried what looked like official fire-watching equipment, binoculars, a logbook, weather monitoring instruments. When he reached the observation cabin, he unlocked the door with a key he produced from his pocket. Once inside, he began a systematic process of preparing for the night watch. As darkness fell and the lamps came on, the tower cabin began glowing with a warm yellow light, a beacon in the wilderness. Throughout that first night, I observed the figure maintaining his watch with a discipline that spoke of genuine professional commitment. Every hour, he would systematically scan each quadrant of the forest. Around 3 a.m., I witnessed something that made me question everything. A genuine fire had started about 5 miles to the southeast, probably a lightning strike. I was reaching for my radio to report the incident when I heard a voice transmission on the emergency frequency, broadcasting the exact location and size of the fire I'd just spotted. The voice was coming from the tower. "Forest Service dispatch. This is Sullivan Township Tower," the transmission began. "I have visual confirmation of a Class 2 fire approximately 5 miles southeast of tower position bearing 142 degrees. Estimated size 2 to 3 acres and spreading. Recommend immediate response." I tried to respond, but my transmission seemed to go unheard. Within minutes, however, I could hear the approach of aircraft. the Forest Service's aerial firefighting team, responding to coordinates provided by the man in the tower. As I watched, helicopter crews began dropping water and retardant on the fire, bringing it under control. The next morning, I hiked to the tower. The steel stairs showed signs of regular use. The observation cabin, which should have been locked and empty, showed evidence of ongoing occupancy. The kerosene lamps were real and functional. The logbooks contained detailed entries documenting weather conditions and fire hazards for every night over the past several months. The equipment was authentic Forest Service gear from the 1960s. That afternoon, I drove into the nearest town to research the history of the tower. What I learned at the local historical society explained everything. The tower's longest-serving fire watcher had been a man named Robert McDougall, who'd manned the post from 1962 until his death in 1989. McDougall had been a legendary figure, known for his ability to spot fires from incredible distances. He had reported over 200 fires during his 27 years in the tower, saving an estimated 50,000 acres of forest. He lived alone in a cabin at the base of the tower, dedicating his entire adult life to the protection of the wilderness. The end had come during a severe thunderstorm in October of 1989, just weeks before the tower was scheduled for decommissioning. McDougall had been struck by lightning while making observations from the platform outside the cabin, killed instantly. The Forest Service had planned a memorial service, but his body had disappeared from the tower sometime during the night after his death, never to be found. McDougall had never accepted the decision to automate fire detection. He'd argued passionately with his supervisors, insisting that electronic equipment could never replace the experienced judgment of a human observer. I returned to my observation post for a second night. As evening approached, and I saw the familiar figure beginning his ascent, I felt a mixture of sadness and admiration for a man whose dedication to duty had transcended death itself. This time, I paid closer attention to the methods McDougall was using. I began to understand that his ghostly fire-watching operation was actually more effective than the automated systems that had replaced him. He could spot the first wisps of smoke from lightning strikes or campfires before they had a chance to develop into serious blazes. His intimate knowledge of local microclimates allowed him to predict fire behavior with remarkable accuracy. During my third night, I made the decision to try direct communication. Using a handheld radio tuned to the frequency he'd been using, I climbed partway up the tower stairs and called out to him. The response came immediately. "This is Sullivan Township Tower. Who am I speaking with?" When I identified myself, there was a long pause. "Supervisor Torres," his spirit finally responded. "I appreciate you coming out to check on the operation. I've been trying to get someone's attention about some equipment upgrades we need and some fire hazards that aren't being addressed by the automated systems." Over the next hour, McDougall's ghost provided me with the most detailed briefing on local forest conditions I'd ever received. He understood that he was dead, but he couldn't abandon his post, because he believed the forest still needed the kind of protection that only human vigilance could provide. I spent the following weeks researching McDougall's recommendations and documenting the accuracy of his fire reports. What I found convinced me that his continuing presence in the tower was providing a level of forest protection that exceeded anything our automated systems could deliver. I prepared a comprehensive report for my supervisors, recommending that the Sullivan Township Fire Tower be officially recommissioned as a heritage site and memorial to Robert McDougall's service. I proposed installing modern communication equipment that would allow McDougall's spirit to interface more effectively with current emergency response systems. The response from Forest Service headquarters was mixed, but ultimately supportive. While they couldn't officially acknowledge the paranormal aspects of McDougall's continued service, they agreed to designate the tower as a historical monument and to station emergency communication equipment there. The tower was cleaned and restored, and the site was rededicated as the Robert McDougall Memorial Fire Tower. Since the rededication, McDougall's presence has become more stable, and his communication with living Forest Service personnel has improved dramatically. He continues his nightly watch, and his fire reports are now officially logged and acted upon. The forest in his sector has experienced significantly fewer major fires. Perhaps most importantly, McDougall's spirit seems to have found a measure of peace in the recognition that his service is valued. He is once again an official protector of the forest, honored for his dedication and respected for his expertise. Today, the Robert McDougall Memorial Fire Tower stands as both a monument to past service and an active component of current forest protection systems. As evening approaches, the tower returns to the exclusive domain of its eternal guardian. Robert McDougall continues his watch, proving that true dedication to duty knows no boundaries, not even the boundary between life and death.